The silence in my living room isn't empty. It's heavy. It has a pulse, slow and steady, like an old grandfather clock that refuses to quit. This morning, that pulse feels thicker than usual. Maybe it's my 70-year-old joints predicting the rain, or maybe it's the quiet buzz radiating from the glossy invitation resting on my ottoman. Silver lettering on eggshell paper. Imani and Terence invite you. My granddaughter, Imani, is a creature of predictability, or so she believes. She is light, all soft curves and eyes that still hold a startling amount of hope. She carries herself with the careful grace of someone who has always been told she is good. But good can be a trap. I know the texture of that trap intimately. I spent decades weaving my own goodness like a shroud, and I recognize the pattern when I see it starting to suffocate her. Terence, on the other hand, is a different vintage. He moves with an easy, borrowed confidence. He has the kind of smile that covers up a vast, shallow, empty space. He looks good on paper, I'll grant him that. But paper burns. He walks a fine line between charm and control, a line so thin most people can't even see it. He makes Imani dim her own light just enough to make his seem brighter. This engagement is a play, and Terence is writing the script. Imani thinks she's a lead character, but I see her as the beautifully placed prop, expected to stay silent until the scene demands her presence. She doesn't see it yet. People rarely do when the trap is this comfortable. I saw it last night. We were discussing the seating arrangements, or rather, Terence was explaining them while Imani nodded, offering soft, ineffectual suggestions that he brushed off with a patronizing chuckle. He enjoys the audience. He thrives on a specific kind of validation, the admiration of his friends who are currently dominating my living room, and the quiet devotion of my granddaughter. It's subtle, the way he operates. A hand placed a little too firmly on her shoulder to guide her. A gentle correction of her memories in mid-conversation. He treats her like an object he is carefully polishing for display. He wants the prestige of a supportive, accomplished wife, but none of the actual noise that comes with an independent mind. Imani smiles through it, but the smile is getting brittle. The lines around her eyes are tense, even when she isn't speaking. She's learning to curate herself, to fit into the spaces he allows. She calls it compromise. I call it erosion. This morning, the pressure seems to be coming from the very walls. Imani is moving around the kitchen, her steps too quick, too efficient. The tension in her shoulders is palpable from 15 feet away. Terence is on the sofa, his phone an extension of his hand, laughing quietly at something. His friends, Jordan and Maya, are there too. They form a wall around him, a filter that ensures only the opinions he approves of ever reach him. They look at Imani with a casual sort of dismissal that makes my tea taste metallic. They see a good girl. They see a pushover. And Terence allows them to see it. He subtly encourages it, reinforcing the narrative that he has civilized her, brought structure to her life. He hasn't built structure. He's built a cage. Imani brings him his coffee exactly how he likes it. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just a glance up and a quick return to his phone. He treats her with the casual indifference one reserves for household infrastructure. Useful, expected, but entirely unremarkable. My stomach churns. This isn't a courtship. This is an acquisition. But I say nothing. I am observing. I am the 70-year-old grandmother. I make tea. I offer polite nods. I am invisible until they decide they need something from me. I am the wallpaper. I have spent my entire life learning that the quietest people often have the clearest view. I can see the fault lines forming, the microscopic cracks in the foundation of this seemingly perfect union. The question isn't whether it will fracture, but how and what role I will play when the walls finally start coming down. They only see my slow movements and polite silence, but they don't realize that the quietest person is often the one designing the end game. If you want to understand the architecture of payback, you'll need to watch this unfold carefully. Don't forget to subscribe to Old School Payback. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate, skeletal shadows across the mahogany dining table. It was a beautiful day for a celebration, or at least the performance of one. Terrence had decided, without asking, that my home was the perfect vintage backdrop for a pre-wedding brunch with his inner circle. I sat in my wingback chair, a silent witness to the invasion. Maya and Jordan were draped over my velvet sofa like they owned the deed to the house. They spoke in the rapid, clipped tones of people who believe their time is more expensive than yours. Terrence stood by the window, adjusting his cufflinks, looking every bit the successful architect of a life he hadn't quite earned yet. And then there was Imani. She was hovering. That's the only word for it. She moved from the kitchen to the dining room with a stack of heirloom plates, her movements jerky, frantic. She was trying to anticipate Terrence's needs before he even realized he had them. She was being the good girl, the role she'd been trained for by a world that rewards female silence with the title of virtuous. Imani, babe, Terrence said, not looking away from his reflection in the window glass. The mimosas? Jordan's glass has been empty for 3 minutes. He didn't say it harshly. That's the trick. He said it with a smooth, casual expectation, as if he were reminding a distracted servant of their duties. Imani froze. Her face flushed a deep, burning crimson. Oh, sorry. I was just getting the quiche out. The quiche can wait. Hospitality can't. Terrence interrupted, flashing a smile at Jordan that signaled a shared understanding. Women and their priorities, the smile said. I watched Imani's hands tremble as she reached for the carafe. She bumped the edge of a crystal flute, and the ringing sound seemed to echo for an eternity in the quiet room. Maya let out a small, sharp giggle behind her hand. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was worse. It was a laugh of pity, the kind you give a clumsy child. Careful, honey, Maya purred. That's the good crystal, right, Nana? I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch until Maya felt the need to shift in her seat. It's just glass, I said finally, my voice low and steady. It can be replaced. Other things not so easily. Terrence turned then, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't like it when the wallpaper spoke back. He walked over to Imani, took the carafe from her shaking hand, and placed a heavy arm around her waist. It looked like an embrace to the untrained eye. To me, it looked like a vice. She's just a little overwhelmed, Terrence told the room, squeezing her side. She's been so focused on being the perfect bride that she's forgotten how to be a person. Isn't that right, sugar? Imani forced a laugh. It was a hollow, brittle sound that broke my heart and steeled my resolve all at once. I just want everything to be right, Terrence. For you. For everyone. And that's why we love her, Jordan added, raising his newly filled glass. The last of the good girls. Loyal to a fault. They toasted to her loyalty, which was really just a toast to her submissiveness. They were celebrating the fact that she was easy to manage. Throughout the meal, the microaggressions continued like a slow drip of acid. Terrence corrected her story about how they met. Maya commented on how brave Imani was to wear such a bold color with her complexion. Jordan made a joke about how Imani would surely be the one to handle all the boring household finances so Terrence could focus on his vision. Every time they cut her, Imani smiled and offered them more coffee. She was bleeding out in front of them, and she was apologizing for the mess. I waited until the guests retreated to the patio to smoke. Imani stayed behind to clear the table, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped under the weight of 1,000 small humiliations. I stood up, my knees popping, a reminder that I didn't have time to waste on subtlety anymore. I walked into the kitchen. She was scrubbing a plate that was already clean, her tears falling silently into the soapy water. "Stop it," I whispered. She didn't look up. "I'm fine, Nana. I tripped earlier, and I feel stupid." "You didn't trip," I said, stepping closer until I could smell the citrus of her perfume and the iron of her pain. "They tripped you, and you let them. You're playing the good girl because you think it will buy you peace. But peace bought with your dignity is just a temporary ceasefire." She finally looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "He loves me, Nana. He's just stressed about the wedding. I have to be supportive. Loyalty is a two-way street, Imani. Right now, you're standing in the middle of a highway, and he's driving the truck. Stop being the good girl. That's why they don't respect you. They don't see a partner. They see a floor mat." The transformation was instant. The grief in her eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, defensive spark of anger. It wasn't directed at Terrence. It was directed at me. "How can you say that?" she hissed, dropping the plate into the sink with a clatter. "You're 70 years old, living in this house alone because you pushed everyone away with your standards. You don't know my relationship. You're just a bitter old woman who wants me to be as lonely as you are." She didn't stop there. She followed me into the hallway, her voice rising, projecting for the guests outside to hear. "You're embarrassing me in front of my friends. You think you're so wise, but you're just judgmental and mean. Maybe that's why Grandpa left you. Maybe he got tired of your strategic silence, too." The patio door slid open. Terrence and his friends stood there, watching the spectacle. Imani saw her audience and doubled down. "Don't you ever give me advice again. Stay in your lane, Nana, or stay in your room." She turned and walked past me, bumping my shoulder intentionally as she went to join Terrence. He wrapped his arm around her again, whispering something in her ear that made her nod defiantly back at me. They looked like a united front. I stood in the dim hallway, the sting of her words settling into my skin. She thought she had won. She thought she had asserted her independence by defending her oppressor. But as I looked at the table, at the unfinished food and the expensive crystal, I noticed something they hadn't. Terrence had left his leather-bound planner on the sideboard, the one he kept locked, the one he thought held his future. I didn't feel insulted. I felt focused. She wanted me to stay in my lane? Fine. But she forgot one thing. I'm the one who paved the road. The house was finally quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that follows a storm, electric and smelling of ozone. They had left in a flurry of expensive perfume and performative laughter, leaving me alone with the ruins of a brunch and the echo of my granddaughter's venom. Bitter. Lonely. Stay in your room. The words didn't sting the way she intended. When you've lived 70 years, you learn that anger is usually just a mask for fear. Imani wasn't mad at me. She was terrified that I was right. She was defending her cage because she'd already spent so much of her soul decorating it. I walked to the sideboard. Terrence's leather-bound planner was still there, forgotten in his haste to whisk Imani away to some calming retail therapy. He was a man who lived by the clock and the checklist. He believed that if you controlled the schedule, you controlled the outcome. I picked it up. It was heavy, bound in genuine calfskin, smelling of cedar and ego. I didn't open it immediately. I sat back down in my wingback chair and let the weight of it rest in my lap. Strategic silence isn't just about not speaking. It's about listening to what isn't being said. And Terrence had been saying a lot through his omissions. For months, I'd watched him manage Imani's finances under the guise of wedding planning. I'd seen the way he checked her phone when she left the room. I'd seen the way he looked at my house, not as a home, but as an asset. I flipped the planner open. His handwriting was precise, architectural. It was filled with meetings for a firm he didn't own yet, and investments that looked suspiciously like gambling on high-risk stocks. But it was the back pocket that held the real treasure, a folded piece of stationery from a boutique hotel downtown, not for a wedding suite. The date was for 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday afternoon when he told Imani he was in back-to-back site visits. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. People like Terrence always leave a trail. They're too arrogant to believe anyone would dare to follow it. He thought I was a relic, a piece of antique furniture that didn't understand the digital age or the complexities of modern ambition. He forgot that I was the one who taught his mother how to balance a ledger when his father left them with nothing but debt. I took out my phone. I'm 70, not dead. I took a steady, clear photo of the receipt and the handwritten note scribbled on the back. Soon, baby, once the papers are signed. The papers weren't just the marriage license. I knew Terrence had been nudging Imani to sell the small plot of land her father had left her, land that sat right in the path of a new commercial development. He wanted the capital to launch his firm. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a silent partner who provided the equity while he provided the vision. And Imani, in her desperate bid to be the good girl, was ready to sign it all away to prove her loyalty. I replaced the planner exactly where he'd left it, down to the millimeter. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Imani. No apology, just a directive. We're staying at Terrence's tonight. I need space from your negativity. Don't touch my things. I didn't reply. I went to the kitchen and began to wash the dishes she had left in the sink. One by one. The crystal flutes, the heirloom plates, the silver. I moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace. The revenge wouldn't be a shouting match. It wouldn't be a dramatic reveal at the altar like a scene from a cheap movie. That's what children do. No, this would be a slow dismantling. I was going to let Terrence build his house of cards to the very highest level. I was going to let him feel the wind of success on his face. And then I was going to pull the single card that held it all together. I looked out the window at the darkening garden. The rain I'd felt in my joints was finally starting to fall. It was a soft, persistent drizzle that would eventually soak everything to the bone. Stay in my room, she'd said. I smiled to myself in the reflection of the darkened glass. I would stay in my room. I would stay in my house. And I would wait. Because the thing about being good is that it makes you predictable. And the thing about being quiet is that no one hears you coming until you're already behind them. The next morning, the house felt lighter, despite the lingering humidity of the rain. Terrence had returned for his planner before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. He didn't knock. He used the spare key Imani had given him without my permission. He swept into the dining room, his eyes darting to the sideboard. When he saw the leather book exactly where he'd left it, a visible wave of relief washed over his face, followed immediately by that smug, practiced mask of superiority. "Morning, Mother Hamilton," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. He didn't look me in the eye. He was already tucking the planner under his arm like a shield. "Hope you slept off that episode from yesterday. Imani's still pretty shaken up. She's got a soft heart. You know, sometimes she forgets that not everyone matures with age." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. It was Earl Grey, steeped exactly 4 minutes. "Age doesn't always bring maturity, Terrence," I replied, my voice as smooth as river stone. "Sometimes it just brings a better vantage point. You see things more clearly when you aren't running quite so fast." He let out a short, dry chuckle. "Clear vision is expensive. Most people can't afford it. We're heading to the city to look at office spaces for the new firm. Big things happening. I'd tell you to wish us luck, but I know how you feel about modern ambition." "I don't mind ambition," I said, setting the cup down without a sound. It's the foundation I worry about. A building is only as strong as the dirt it sits on. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. For a split second, the mask slipped. There was a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, in the way he gripped the planner. But then he laughed it off, gave a mock salute, and disappeared. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before I moved. I didn't call Imani. I didn't send a frantic text about the hotel receipt. If I showed her the truth now, she would see it as a forgery, another attack from her bitter grandmother. She was currently addicted to the good girl narrative, and an addict will burn down the house to protect their supply. Instead, I made a different call. Clarence, it's Elena. I hope you're still keeping those archives at the courthouse as neat as your garden used to be. Clarence had been a clerk for 40 years. He knew where every body was buried, mostly because he'd filed the permits for the cemeteries. We spoke for 20 minutes, not about the wedding, but about the commercial development project on the east side. The one Terrence was so eager to invest in using Imani's land. It's a delicate situation, Elena, Clarence whispered over the line. The zoning hasn't gone through yet. There's a quiet dispute over the access road. If that road doesn't get approved, that land is just a very expensive patch of weeds. And who is pushing the road through? I asked. A shell company, Apex Visionaries, registered to a downtown address. But the lead architect listed on the preliminary filing, a fellow named Terrence. I thanked him and hung up. The picture was complete. Terrence wasn't just marrying Imani for her land. He was fronting a project that required her land to be profitable. He was essentially stealing from his bride to pay a debt to a future he hadn't built yet. And the papers mentioned in the hotel note, they weren't just about the firm. They were likely a power of attorney or a transfer of deed. He was moving fast because he was broke. The expensive suits, the brunch, the vintage aesthetic. It was all a theater of wealth designed to keep Imani compliant until the signatures were dry. I went to my desk and pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a set of cufflinks that had belonged to my late husband, solid gold, engraved with a crest that meant nothing to anyone but our family. I didn't need the money, but I knew someone who did. I spent the afternoon, not in my room, but in my garden, pruning the roses. You have to be careful when you prune. If you cut too deep, the plant dies. If you don't cut enough, the dead weight chokes the new growth. It requires a steady hand and a lack of sentimentality. As the sun began to set, I saw Imani's car pull into the driveway. She stayed in the car for a long time, her head resting on the steering wheel. When she finally climbed out, she looked exhausted. The good girl mask was slipping, revealing a woman who was beginning to feel the cold draft of the truth she was trying so hard to ignore. She walked past me, without a word, her eyes fixed on the porch. "The roses are coming along nicely," I said softly as she passed. "Though the aphids are trying their best to ruin them. They hide under the leaves, you see. You don't know they're there until the flower starts to wilt from the inside out." She stopped, her back to me. Her shoulders shook for a fraction of a second, but she didn't turn around. "I don't care about your metaphors, Nana. I just want to be happy." "Happiness is a choice, Imani," I said to the back of her head. "But safety is a luxury provided by the truth. Sleep well. Tomorrow is a big day." I didn't tell her why tomorrow was big. I didn't tell her that I'd already sent an anonymous tip to the local business journal about zoning irregularities involving Apex Visionaries. I was staying in my lane. It just so happened that my lane was the one where the finish line was located. The following morning arrived with a sterile, surgical brightness. Terrence had scheduled a branding meeting at my dining table, inviting a local independent consultant he was trying to woo into his supposed firm. He wanted to look established, and my home with its crown molding and century-old floors, provided the perfect illusion of generational wealth. Imani was dressed in a stiff, high-collared blouse that looked like it was choking her. She was serving tea again, playing the silent hostess while Terence spread blueprints across the mahogany. He was expansive, his voice booming with the false confidence of a man who hasn't yet realized the floor is rotting beneath him. The aesthetic is legacy modern, Terence told the consultant, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Sterling. We take the old foundations, like this property, and we strip away the clutter. We make it efficient, profitable. He tapped a finger on a section of the blueprint. This area here, that's the development. Once the access road is finalized, the valuation triples. It's a closed loop, guaranteed. Ms. Sterling leaned in, her glasses catching the light. And the land ownership, I see it's still listed under a private estate. Terence didn't blink. He reached over and squeezed Imani's hand, a gesture that looked affectionate, but felt like a physical shackle. My fiancé is the sole heir. We're consolidating the assets next week. It's all within the family. Imani gave a small, forced nod. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for me to stay quiet, to stay in my room, to not ruin this moment of triumph she so desperately wanted to believe in. I sat in the corner with my embroidery, the needle clicking rhythmically against the hoop. In and out, tension and release. That's interesting, I said, not looking up from my work. My voice was a soft ripple in a still pond. I didn't realize the city had resolved the environmental impact study on that access road. The wetlands are quite protected in that sector. The room went cold. Terence's hand tightened on Imani's until her knuckles turned white. He turned to me, his smile a jagged line of suppressed rage. Mother Hamilton, I think we discussed this. Professional matters are a bit outside your area of expertise. Oh, I'm sure, I murmured, finally looking up. I held his gaze with a terrifyingly calm clarity. But I was reading the morning paper. There was a small blurb about an anonymous inquiry into Apex visionaries. Something about zoning irregularities and a lack of transparency regarding shell companies. It seemed relevant. Ms. Sterling's eyebrows shot up. She pulled out her tablet. Zoning irregularities? I wasn't told about any investigations. Because there aren't any. Terence snapped, his voice cracking just enough to betray him. He turned back to the consultant, sweating now. It's just gossip. Local politics. Old people with too much time on their hands. Is it? I asked, my voice tilting with a hint of curiosity. Because I also noticed a letter on the hall table this morning. From the bank. Something about a notice of default on a personal line of credit. I must have misread the name on the envelope. I thought it said Terence, but my eyes aren't what they used to be. I hadn't seen a letter. There was no letter. But I knew the math of a man like him. He was living on credit and prayer, and I had just whispered a Hail Mary that sounded like a funeral march. Terence stood up, so quickly his chair screeched against the floor. Imani, get your grandmother some water. She's clearly confused. But Imani didn't move. She was staring at Terence, really looking at him for the first time. She saw the sweat on his brow. She saw the way his eyes darted toward his leather planner. She saw the fear he was trying to mask with aggression. Is there a default, Terence? She asked. Her voice was quiet, but the good girl lilt was gone. It was replaced by a hollow, ringing suspicion. Of course not. She's trying to sabotage us. Imani, can't you see that? She's bitter because she's irrelevant. He turned to Ms. Sterling, trying to salvage the meeting, but the consultant was already packing her bag. I think we should pause here. Terence, my firm doesn't align with irregularities. Give me a call when the air is clear. As the front door clicked shut, the silence that rushed back into the house was deafening. Terence turned on me, his face contorted. You old hag. You just cost me everything. Do you have any idea what you've done? I haven't done anything, Terrence, I said, standing up slowly, smoothing my skirt. I just moved the curtain. If you didn't like what was behind it, perhaps you should have built a better stage. He lunged toward me, but Imani stepped between us, not out of love for me, but out of a sudden, sharp realization of her own worth. Don't touch her, Imani whispered, and don't lie to me again. Are you broke, Terrence? Is that why we're consolidating my father's land? I'm doing it for us, he shouted. For our future. No, she said, her voice trembling but holding firm. You're doing it for you, and you're using me as the down payment. Terrence looked at her, then at me. He realized the good girl had finally stopped following the script. He grabbed his planner and stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the crystal in the cabinet. Imani sank into a chair, her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She just sat there, breathing in the wreckage of the life she thought she wanted. I walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away this time. He's going to the hotel, I said softly. She looked up, confused. What hotel? The one on the receipt in his planner. The one where the papers are waiting. If you want the truth, the whole truth, we have about 20 minutes to get there. The drive downtown was conducted in a silence so brittle I feared the vibration of the engine might shatter it. Imani gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She wasn't the good girl anymore. She was a woman suspended in that terrible, translucent moment between a lie and the light. He wouldn't, she whispered, more to the windshield than to me. He said that hotel was for his firm's out-of-town investors. He said he was building a legacy for us. Nana. Men like Terrence don't build legacies, Imani. I said, my voice as steady as the rhythmic thump of the tires over the pavement. They build illusions. Legacies require deep roots. Illusions just require a captive audience. We arrived at the Grand Marquis. It was the kind of place that sold discretion at a premium, all gold leaf and hushed carpet. I led the way. At 70, people don't see you as a threat. They see a grandmother looking for the restroom or a lost knitting bag. We stepped into the lobby, the scent of expensive lilies thick enough to choke. I didn't need to ask the concierge for a room number. I had seen the scribbled digits on the back of that receipt in Terrence's planner. 412. The elevator ride felt like descending into a deep well. When the doors slid open on the 4th floor, the hallway stretched out like a long, velvet tongue. We walked softly as we approached the door. To 412, the sound of muffled laughter drifted through the wood. It wasn't Terrence's professional laugh, the one he used to impress Ms. Sterling. It was his real laugh. Relaxed. Cruel. I leaned against the wall, my arms crossed, watching Imani. She reached for the handle, then hesitated. Her hand hovered an inch from the brass, trembling. This was the threshold. Once she opened this door, the version of her life she had curated so carefully would cease to exist. You don't have to go in, I whispered. You already know what's behind it. I have to see, she breathed. I have to see the person I was willing to give my life to. She turned the handle. It was unlocked. Terrence was always so sure of his own cleverness that he often forgot the simplest bolts. The suite was bathed in the amber glow of the afternoon sun. Terrence was sitting at a small round table, a bottle of champagne in a silver bucket beside him. Across from him sat a woman, younger, sharper, dressed in the kind of effortless silk that spoke of someone else's money. On the table between them lay a stack of documents. The papers. It's almost done, Chloe. Terrence was saying, his back to us. He sounded relieved. The old lady tipped off the press, so I have to move the timeline up. I'll get Imani to sign the power of attorney tonight. Once the land transfer is logged, we'll sell the development rights to the holding company. We'll be in Cabo by the time she realizes the wedding isn't happening. The woman, Chloe, laughed, a sharp metallic sound. And the good girl? What happens when she finds out her architect husband is just a middleman with a gambling debt? She's a good girl. Chloe, Terrence sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. She'll cry, she'll pray, and then she'll blame herself for not being enough to keep me. That's the beauty of her type. They apologize for being walked on. Imani didn't scream. She didn't rush in with a dramatic flair. She simply pushed the door all the way open until it hit the stopper with a dull thud. Terrence froze. The color drained from his face so quickly it looked like he'd seen a ghost. He stood up, knocking his chair over. Imani, what are you doing here? Imani walked into the room. She looked at the papers on the table, the ones with her father's name and her inheritance listed as collateral. She looked at Chloe, who was suddenly very interested in her fingernails. Finally, she looked at Terrence. I'm here to apologize, Imani said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It was a voice I recognized. It was mine. Terrence blinked, a flicker of hope crossing his eyes. Apologize? Baby, listen, this isn't what it looks like. It's a business strategy. I had to protect you from your grandmother's interference. No, Imani interrupted, stepping closer until she was inches from him. I'm apologizing to my Nana for calling her bitter, for telling her to stay in her room, because while I was busy trying to be a good girl for a ghost, she was the only one standing at the gates, keeping watch. She picked up the champagne bottle from the bucket. For a second, Terrence flinched, expecting a blow, but Imani simply poured the icy water from the bucket over the documents on the table. The ink began to bleed. The papers turned into a gray, illegible pulp. The land isn't for sale, Terrence, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the silent suite. And neither am I. You have 1 hour to get your things out of my grandmother's house. If you're still there when we get back, I won't call the police. I'll call the business journal back and give them the name of the holding company you're hiding behind. She turned and walked out, her head held high, her spine like a steel rod. I stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at Terrence. He looked small. He looked like a man who had realized too late that the person he'd been underestimating wasn't just the grandmother, but the woman she had raised. You should have listened to her, Terrence, I said softly. The roses have thorns for a reason. As we walked back to the elevator, Imani didn't cry. She didn't look back. She just pressed the button for the lobby and looked at her reflection in the polished brass doors. Nana, she asked as the car began to move. Yes, honey. How did you know about the holding company? I adjusted my pearls and offered a small, knowing smile. I didn't, but I knew Terrence. And a man like that always has a second door he thinks no one knows about. I just made sure he left it open. The sun was setting by the time we pulled back into the driveway, casting long, bruised shadows across the lawn. The house stood silent, a sentinel of brick and memory. Imani didn't rush inside. She sat in the passenger seat for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, empty, yet heavier than they had been this morning. The weight of a shattered future is a specific kind of burden. He'll be there, she whispered. He won't just go, Nana. He spent too much time measuring the windows to just walk away from the view. I expect he will be, I replied, my voice a calm anchor. Pride is a noisy guest. It rarely leaves without making a scene. I opened the front door with my own key, the original, the one that had turned in this lock since before Terrence was a glimmer in his mother's eye. The air inside smelled of stale cologne and desperation. Terrence was in the dining room. He wasn't packing. He was sitting at the mahogany table, a bottle of my late husband's bourbon open in front of him. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled. The architect had become a squatter. You're late, he said, his voice thick but sharp. He didn't look at Imani. He looked at me. You think you've won? You think a little water on some paper changes the contracts I've already promised? People are counting on that land. Elena, dangerous people. People who don't care about old school manners. Imani stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. Get out, Terrence. I've already called the locksmith. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Terrence laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. The locksmith? Honey, I have the master key to your life. I know your passwords, your accounts, your little good girl secrets. You think you can just delete me? I'm woven into the fabric of everything you own. He stood up, swaying slightly, and pointed a finger at me. And you're the one who started this. You couldn't just sit in your chair and die quietly, could you? You had to poke the bear. I didn't flinch. I walked to the sideboard, picked up the bourbon bottle, and placed the cap back on it with a firm, decisive twist. A bear is a noble creature. Terrence, you're more of a termite. You hollow things out from the inside and act surprised when the roof collapses. I'm not leaving until I get what I'm owed, he hissed, stepping toward Imani. The consulting fee for the development, 100,000. Transfer it tonight, or I start leaking the private photos you sent me last summer. Let's see how good the girl looks then. The room went cold. It was the ultimate betrayal, the weaponization of intimacy. Imani's face went white, her breath hitching in her throat. The good girl was being threatened with the one thing she feared most, shame. I felt a spark of heat in my chest, but I kept my face as still as a winter pond. Blackmail, Terrence, that's a very messy tool for a man who claims to value precision. It's leverage, he corrected, a cruel smirk returning to his lips. And it's effective. I suppose it is, I said, reaching into my apron pocket. I pulled out my phone, the one Terrence thought I only used for weather reports and bird pictures. I tapped the screen and laid it face up on the table. A recording began to play. I'll get Imani to sign the power of attorney tonight. Once the land transfer is logged, we'll sell the development rights to the holding company. We'll be in Cabo by the time she realizes the wedding isn't happening. It was the conversation from the hotel. Clear, crisp, indisputable. I didn't just poke the bear. Terrence, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. I recorded the hunter, and I didn't stop there. While you were drinking my bourbon, I sent a digital copy of this, along with the photos I took of your papers, to your primary investor. The one you told Imani was an out-of-town associate. I believe his name is Mr. Henderson, the man who doesn't like his money being played with. Terrence's smirk vanished. His eyes went wide, reflecting the glow of the phone screen like a trapped animal. You sent it to Henderson? I did, and I added a small note about the notice of default on your credit line. I imagine he's quite curious about where his capital has actually been going. Terrence's phone began to vibrate on the table. The caller ID read, Henderson. The silence that followed was absolute. The vibration of the phone was the only heartbeat in the room. Terrence looked at the device as if it were a live grenade. He knew that world. He knew that when men like Henderson realize they've been swindled, they don't call the police. They call for adjustments. You've destroyed me, Terrence whispered, his voice cracking. No, I said, stepping closer until I could see the sweat on his upper lip. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure the right people were watching the demolition. Now you have a choice. You can stay here and wait for the locksmith, or you can take your things and try to get to the airport before Mr. Henderson decides he wants a face-to-face meeting. Terrence didn't say another word. He didn't look at Imani. He grabbed his jacket, his phone still buzzing frantically, and practically ran for the door. The sound of his tires screeching out of the driveway was the most beautiful music I'd heard in years. Imani sank into a chair, her head in her hands. This time, she did cry. Soft, shuddering sobs of relief and grief. I sat beside her, rubbing her back in slow, steady circles. "It's over, honey," I whispered. "He was going to ruin me. Nana," she sobbed. "Even after I caught him, he was going to ruin me." "He couldn't," I said firmly, "because he never understood the difference between being good and being right. You were never his victim, Imani. You were his lesson." She looked up at me, her eyes wet but searching. "What now?" I looked around my quiet, beautiful home. The dust had settled. The termite was gone. "Now," I said, "we change the locks. And then we have dinner. I believe there's a bottle of wine in the cellar that's been waiting for a truly special occasion." The locksmith arrived at dusk, his tools clinking with a rhythmic, industrial finality. He didn't ask questions. He simply removed the cylinders Terrence had compromised and replaced them with heavy, reinforced brass. I stood on the porch, watching the light from his headlamp dance across the dark wood of the door. With every turn of the screw, the air in the house seemed to grow purer, as if the very walls were exhaling a long-held breath. Imani was in the kitchen. She wasn't hovering or serving. She was sitting at the breakfast nook, a single lamp casting a warm glow over a stack of legal folders. She was reading, really reading, the details of her father's estate. She looked older, or perhaps just less obscured. The good girl had been a mask that didn't quite fit the contours of her soul. The woman emerging was sharper, more deliberate. "He called," she said, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. She didn't look up from the page. "Terrence," 3 times from a blocked number. He sounded small. "Nana." He wanted to know if I could talk to Henderson for him. He said he was at a motel near the airport and his car wouldn't start. I walked over and set a plate of sliced pears and sharp cheddar on the table. "And what did you tell him?" "I didn't tell him anything," she said, finally meeting my eyes. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, not a happy smile, but one of profound understanding. I just listened to the silence on the other end until he realized I wasn't going to fill it. Then I hung up and blocked the number. Strategic silence, I murmured, sitting across from her. It's a powerful language. We spent the evening not in mourning, but in inventory. We talked about the land, not as a development opportunity for a shell company, but as a sanctuary. We decided to keep it wild, a buffer against the noise of the world, just as her father had intended. Later that night, after Imani had retreated to the guest room, sleeping deeply for the first time in months, I went out to the garden. The moon was a silver sliver, hanging low over the oaks. The roses were still there, their thorns hidden in the shadows, their fragrance heavy in the cool air. I pulled my phone from my pocket. One last message to send. Not to Terrence, not to Henderson. I sent a short, encrypted file to the city's lead environmental auditor. It contained the GPS coordinates of the protected nesting grounds I'd discovered on the east side of the property years ago. By morning, that access road Terrence had banked his entire future on would be legally blocked by federal conservation laws. It wouldn't just be delayed, it would be extinct. The land would stay hers, the debts would stay his, and the architect would find himself without a blueprint, a foundation, or a way out. Revenge isn't a fire. Fire is messy. It leaves ashes that can blow back into your own eyes. True payback is like a garden. You plant the seeds of a person's own character. You water them with the truth, and then you simply wait for them to be choked by the weeds they refuse to pull. I walked back into the house and turned the deadbolt. Click. The sound was a period, a full stop at the end of a very long, very tired sentence. I am 70 years old. I am observant. I am patient. And I am finally, truly back in my room. But the door is no longer a barrier. It's a choice. Terrence thought he was playing a game of checkers with a relic, only to realize he was being dismantled by a grandmaster. My granddaughter has her name back, her land back, and most importantly, her spine. The good girl is dead, and a wise woman has taken her place. If you enjoyed seeing how a quiet grandma handles a loud mistake, make sure to hit that like button. It helps the algorithm find more people who need to remember that the oldest trees have the deepest roots. Subscribe to Old School Payback for more stories with a calculated win and the arrogant fall. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to stop being good to start being respected? I'd love to hear your story while I sip my tea.